The bell above the door of the grind chimed softly as Eleanor Whitmore stepped inside, shaking droplets of October rain from her auburn hair. At exactly 7:15 a.m., just as she had every weekday for the past 3 months since moving to Millbrook, Vermont, the familiar warmth of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon wrapped around her like a welcomed embrace, a stark contrast to the grey morning that had soaked through her light jacket during the 6-block walk from her apartment above the antique shop. Marcus Chen looked up from behind the espresso machine, his warm brown eyes crinkling slightly at the corners in what she'd come to recognize as his version of a smile. "Medium coffee, splash of cream, no sugar," he said, already reaching for a cup before she could speak. His voice carried the slightest trace of an accent she couldn't quite place, softened by years of American inflection. "You know me too well," Ellie replied, fumbling in her purse for exact change. It had become a small point of pride for her, having the right coins ready, as if this tiny efficiency could somehow make up for the way she lingered longer than necessary, reluctant to return to the quiet of her new life. But this morning was different. As she counted out quarters, her fingers trembled slightly from the cold, and the coins scattered across the worn wooden counter. Marcus reached out instinctively to help gather them, his calloused fingers brushing against hers for just a moment. The contact sent an unexpected warmth up her arm, and when she looked up, she found him studying her with concern. "You're soaked," he observed, stating the obvious with such gentle matter-of-factness that it didn't feel patronizing. The storm came out of nowhere, didn't it? Through the large front window, rain pelted the glass in sheets, turning Main Street into a watercolor blur of muted colors. A few early commuters hurried past under umbrellas, heads bent against the wind. Ellie had been so lost in thought during her walk that she'd barely noticed the weather changing from drizzle to downpour. "I don't mind the rain," she said, which was partially true. After 18 years of marriage to a man who had complained about every minor inconvenience, she'd learned to find peace in small discomforts. They felt honest, somehow. Marcus disappeared into the back room without a word, leaving her standing at the counter feeling slightly foolish. She could hear him moving around, opening what sounded like a closet door. When he returned, he carried a navy blue flannel shirt, soft from washing and smelling faintly of cedar. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "You can't walk home in that wet jacket. You'll catch pneumonia, and then who would I make coffee for at exactly 7:15 every morning?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with more meaning than either had intended. Ellie felt heat rise to her cheeks as she realized he'd noticed her routine, that her daily visits had become as much a part of his morning as they were hers. "I couldn't take your shirt," she protested, even as she longed to accept the offered warmth. "It's not a gift, it's a loan," Marcus said, his tone gentle but firm. "Besides, the storm looks like it might last a while. Why don't you sit by the window until it passes? I was just about to try a new blend anyway. I could use an honest opinion." Ellie glanced toward the window, where a small table sat bathed in the grey morning light. She'd noticed it before, always empty, positioned perfectly to watch the street while remaining partially hidden from passers-by. It seemed almost designed for someone who preferred to observe rather than be observed. "I don't want to impose," she said, the words automatic after years of making herself small, unobtrusive. "You're not," Marcus replied simply, and something in his tone made her believe him. She accepted the shirt, grateful for its warmth as she slipped it over her damp blouse. It was too large, the sleeves hanging past her wrists, but it smelled like safety and kindness. As she settled into the chair by the window, she watched Marcus work with practiced grace. His movements were economical, efficient, but there was an artistry to the way he measured coffee, adjusted the grinder, tested the temperature of the milk. Everything done with care and attention to detail. "Have you always been a coffee shop owner?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness in extending their usual brief exchange into actual conversation. Marcus paused in his grinding, considering the question. "Not always," he said finally. "I used to build furniture, custom pieces, mostly, but there's something about coffee that brings people together in a way that furniture never could. A table might bring a family together for dinner, but coffee is about the moments in between, the conversations that happen when people have time to really see each other." Ellie sipped the coffee he'd brought her, a rich blend with notes of chocolate and something she couldn't identify. "This is wonderful. What's the mystery ingredient?" "Cardamom," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "My grandmother's secret. She used to say that cardamom was the spice of stories, that it made people want to linger and talk." "Your grandmother sounds wise." A shadow passed across Marcus's features, so quickly she almost missed it. "She was. She taught me that the best conversations happen when people feel safe, when they're not rushing to be somewhere else." Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, the wind had picked up, sending leaves skittering across the wet pavement. But inside the grind, with the warm light of the overhead lamps and the steady rhythm of rain against glass, Ellie felt more at peace than she had in months. "I should probably know this after 3 months of daily visits," she said. "But what brought you to Millbrook? It's not exactly a metropolis." Marcus was quiet for so long that she wondered if she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen. "Sometimes you need to find a place where you can start over, where people judge you by who you are today, rather than who you used to be." Ellie understood that sentiment more than he could know. "That's why I'm here too," she admitted. "Fresh start, new life, all that." "And how's it working out for you?" She considered the question honestly. Some days are better than others. The quiet takes getting used to. In Boston, there was always noise, always something happening. Here, you notice things more, like the way the light changes throughout the day, or how Mrs. Patterson arranges the books in her shop window, or... She trailed off, realizing she was about to say something about how she looked forward to these morning moments with him. Or, Marcus prompted gently, or how some routines become the best part of your day, she finished, meeting his eyes. The moment stretched between them, charged with understanding and possibility. For the first time since her divorce, Ellie felt seen by someone, truly seen, not just as the librarian or the new woman in town or someone's ex-wife, but as herself. Marcus leaned forward slightly, and she caught a glimpse of something deeper in his expression, a longing that matched her own. But before either could speak, the bell above the door chimed with particular violence as it was pushed open against the wind. Mrs. Henderson stepped inside, shaking her umbrella with the kind of vigorous disapproval that seemed to be her default expression. She was a woman in her 70s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a bun, so tight it seemed to lift her eyebrows permanently into an expression of surprise and judgment. Her sharp blue eyes took in the scene immediately. Ellie in Marcus's shirt, sitting at the intimate table by the window, coffee cups between them like evidence of some crime. "Well," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying clearly through the small space, "isn't this cozy?" The spell-broken Ellie felt heat flood her face. She started to rise, suddenly aware of how the scene must look to someone who specialized in finding impropriety in innocent situations. "Mrs. Henderson," Marcus said evenly, moving behind the counter. "What can I get for you this morning?" "My usual," she replied crisply, never taking her eyes off Ellie, "though I see you've been busy this morning." Ellie stood, gathering her purse and preparing to flee, but Marcus's voice stopped her. "Actually," he said, reaching under the counter, "I was hoping you could return this when you're ready." He held out a small piece of paper, folded once. "No rush." Their fingers touched as she took it, a brief contact that somehow felt like a promise. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed, cataloguing every detail of the exchange. "Thank you for the shirt," Ellie said, suddenly formal under the older woman's scrutiny. "I'll get it back to you soon." "Keep it until you need it less," Marcus replied, and though his words were simple, she heard the deeper meaning. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle as Ellie stepped outside, Mrs. Henderson's disapproving gaze burning between her shoulder blades. She didn't unfold the note until she was safely inside her apartment, sitting on her small couch with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. The handwriting was careful, precise. "Some conversations are worth the wait. M." Ellie traced the letters, with her finger feeling something unfurling in her chest that she'd thought had died during the long, cold end of her marriage. Hope, maybe, or possibility, or simply the recognition that she wasn't as alone as she'd believed. Outside her window, Millbrook continued its quiet morning routine. Mrs. Patterson opened her bookstore, arranging the display with the same care she showed every day. The postal worker made his rounds, waving to the early commuters. And somewhere, 6 blocks away, Marcus was probably serving coffee to other customers. But for a moment, this moment, Ellie allowed herself to believe that their brief conversation had mattered to him as much as it had to her. She folded the note carefully and placed it between the pages of the book she was reading, a small secret to carry with her through the day. The next morning, Ellie found herself taking extra care with her appearance, choosing a soft green sweater that brought out her eyes and taking time with her hair. She told herself it was just about feeling put together, but she knew she was lying. Marcus's face lit up when she entered the grind, though he tried to hide it by busying himself with her order. "Medium coffee, splash of cream, no sugar," he said, but this time he added, "And how did you sleep?" It was such a simple question, the kind neighbors might ask each other, but it felt revolutionary. When was the last time someone had cared about such a basic aspect of her well-being? "Better than I have in months," she admitted. "Though I should return your shirt. I washed it." "No rush," he said, echoing yesterday's words. "Weather's supposed to turn colder this week. You might need it again." As she waited for her coffee, Ellie noticed Marcus had reorganized the small display of local honey and baked goods near the register. A book sat prominently among the items, Vermont Wildlife Through the Seasons. She recognized it from the library's collection, though this was clearly a personal copy, well-thumbed and marked with small post-it notes. "Is that yours?" she asked, nodding toward the book. "Guilty pleasure," Marcus said, with a slightly embarrassed smile. "I like knowing about the animals I share the woods with when I go hiking. The library had a copy, but it was always checked out." "I'm the librarian," Ellie said, feeling foolish for not mentioning it sooner. "I could have put it aside for you." Marcus paused in his coffee preparation, looking genuinely surprised. "You're Eleanor Whitmore. I should have put that together." Mrs. Patterson mentioned the new librarian, but she just said, "A lovely woman from the city." "Lovely might be generous," Ellie said, then immediately regretted the self-deprecating comment. She was working on breaking that habit. "I disagree," Marcus said quietly, handing her the coffee. Their fingers brushed again, and this time neither pulled away immediately. The bell chimed as another customer entered, Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store. He nodded politely at Ellie before ordering his usual large black coffee. As Marcus prepared it, Tom made casual conversation about the weather and the upcoming town festival. But Ellie noticed how his eyes flicked between her and Marcus, noting the easy familiarity of their interaction. After Tom left, Marcus turned back to her. "I should probably mention," he said, wiping down the counter with perhaps more attention than necessary, "that people in small towns notice things, and they talk about us." Ellie felt a flutter of both anxiety and something that might have been excitement. About anything that breaks the routine, Marcus said diplomatically. New people, changes in patterns, connections that weren't there before. Ellie sipped her coffee, thinking. Does that bother you? Marcus considered the question seriously. It might complicate things, he said finally, but some things are worth a little complication. The words hung between them, loaded with possibility and risk in equal measure. Ellie found herself nodding, surprised by her own courage. Over the following weeks, their morning conversations became the anchor point of both their days. Marcus began opening 15 minutes early, ostensibly to prepare for the day, but really so they could talk without the interruption of other customers. They discussed books. Ellie brought him recommendations from the library, always with thoughtful notes tucked between the pages. They talked about the town, sharing observations about its rhythms and characters. Marcus told her about his hiking trails, describing the way morning light filtered through the maple canopy, and Ellie found herself wanting to see those places through his eyes. But with their growing connection came increased scrutiny. Mrs. Henderson made a point of timing her coffee runs to coincide with Ellie's visits, her sharp eyes cataloguing every shared glance, every moment their hands touched. During the exchange of coffee and payment, she wasn't alone in her interest. Ellie began to notice other customers lingering longer than necessary, conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered the library, knowing looks exchanged when she passed groups of townspeople on the street. The attention made her increasingly self-conscious. She'd moved to Millbrook specifically to escape the gossip and judgment that had surrounded her divorce, and now she felt that familiar sensation of being watched, evaluated, found wanting in some fundamental way. At the library, the whispers were more subtle, but no less pointed. Mrs. Carruthers, who chaired the library board, made comments about certain people who didn't understand small-town values when discussing the upcoming holiday display. Sarah Mills, a frequent patron, mentioned that she'd heard the divorced woman from Boston was making herself quite comfortable with people who keep to themselves for good reason. The comment stung because they echoed her ex-husband's criticisms that she was too trusting, too eager to see the best in people, too naive about the way the world really worked. She'd spent years believing those criticisms, shrinking herself to avoid causing problems or drawing unwanted attention. Marcus seemed to be facing his own pressures. She noticed him becoming more formal during busy periods, serving her coffee, with polite efficiency but none of their usual warmth when other customers were present. The books she left for him began accumulating behind the counter, unreturned. Their early morning conversations grew shorter, more careful. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in mid-November. Ellie arrived to find the grind busier than usual, filled with members of the town council grabbing coffee before their monthly meeting. Marcus served her quickly, barely making eye contact, and she felt the familiar sting of rejection that she'd hoped she'd left behind in Boston. As she turned to leave, she overheard council member Janet Russell speaking to her companion in a voice just loud enough to be overheard. "I'm just saying, that coffee shop used to be such a peaceful place. Now it's all complicated. Poor Marcus probably feels obligated to be nice to her since she's a regular customer. You know how these lonely divorced women can be. They read too much into simple kindness." The words hit Ellie like a physical blow. She fumbled with the door handle, desperate to escape, coffee forgotten on the counter. Behind her she heard Marcus's voice, sharp with anger. "Mrs. Russell, I think you might be confusing kindness with something else entirely." But Ellie was already outside, walking rapidly toward the library, her face burning with humiliation. The worst part wasn't the cruelty of the comment. She'd endured worse during her divorce. The worst part was the seed of doubt it planted. Was she misreading Marcus's attention? Had she become the pathetic divorced woman who mistook professional courtesy for genuine interest? By the time she reached the library, Ellie had made a decision. She would vary her routine, find a different coffee shop, or simply make coffee at home. She wouldn't subject Marcus to more gossip, and she wouldn't give the town more ammunition for their judgments. She avoided the grind for 3 days, taking a longer route to work that bypassed Main Street entirely. She made coffee at home and told herself it tasted just as good. She threw herself into organizing the library's holiday display with fierce determination, staying late each evening to avoid the possibility of running into Marcus during his usual closing routine. On Sunday morning, unable to sleep and desperate for a distraction, she decided to visit the small hiking trail Marcus had mentioned, the one where morning light filtered through maple canopy. She needed to clear her head, to remember who she was, outside of other people's opinions and expectations. The trail was more beautiful than she'd imagined, with golden leaves carpeting the path and frost glittering on bare branches. She walked for nearly an hour, breathing in the crisp air and trying to sort through her feelings. Was she giving up too easily? Was she letting other people's judgments dictate her choices again, just as she had during her marriage? Lost in thought, she almost missed the figure sitting on a fallen log beside the trail. Marcus looked up as she approached, his expression cycling through surprise, relief, and something that looked like pain. "Ellie," he said, rising to his feet. I wasn't sure I'd see you again." "You come here often?" she asked. Then, immediately felt foolish for the awkward small talk. "When I need to think," he admitted. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately." They stood facing each other on the leaf-strewn path, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "You stopped coming to the shop." It wasn't a question, and Ellie found herself unable to meet his eyes. "I thought it might be better, less complicated." For who? The question forced her to look at him, and she saw something raw in his expression that made her chest tighten. "For both of us. The things people are saying—" "I don't care what people say," Marcus interrupted, stepping closer. "I care that you disappeared without a word. I care that you thought so little of what we were building that you'd rather run away than face a little gossip." The accusation stung because it held more truth than she wanted to acknowledge. "It wasn't little gossip," she said defensively. "Mrs. Russell said, Mrs. Russell is a bitter woman who can't stand seeing other people find happiness," Marcus said firmly. "She's also wrong. What I feel for you has nothing to do with obligation or pity or any of the other small-minded explanations this town wants to create." The words hung in the crisp morning air, honest and vulnerable. Ellie felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from relief. She'd been so afraid that she'd misread everything, that she'd created a connection that existed only in her imagination. "I was scared," she admitted. "My ex-husband used to say that I misunderstood people's intentions, that I made things complicated when they were simple. I started to wonder if I was doing it again." Marcus's expression softened. "Your ex-husband sounds like someone who wanted you to doubt yourself. That's not the same thing as being wise about people's intentions. So what do we do?" Ellie asked. "The town clearly has opinions about whatever this is between us." "We decide what matters more," Marcus said simply. "Their opinions or our happiness." Before Ellie could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it automatically, then frowned. The message was from an unknown number. "Marcus Chen, immigration status under review. Thought you should know. A friend." Ice formed in her stomach as she stared at the screen. When she looked up, Marcus was watching her with an expression of dawning dread. "What is it?" he asked. Wordlessly, she handed him the phone. His face went pale as he read the message, and she watched something crumble in his expression. "Marcus," she started, but he was already shaking his head. "I have to go," he said, handing back her phone and walking quickly toward the trailhead. "Wait," Ellie called, hurrying after him. "We need to talk about this." But Marcus had already reached his car, parked at the small lot at the trail's entrance. He paused with his hand on the door handle, not turning around. "There's nothing to talk about," he said quietly. "I should have known this would happen." "What does it mean?" "The message." Marcus finally turned, and the pain in his expression made her step back. "It means our timing was terrible," he said. "And it means you were right to stay away." He drove off before she could respond, leaving her standing alone in the parking lot with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that something much larger and more dangerous than small-town gossip was unfolding. Ellie spent Sunday evening researching immigration law on her laptop, trying to understand what status under review might mean and why someone would send her an anonymous text about it. The more she read, the more worried she became. Immigration reviews could be triggered by any number of factors, from routine audits to specific complaints. They could result in anything from renewed documentation to... She didn't want to think about the alternatives. Monday morning, she walked to the grind with determination, ready to demand answers and offer support. But the coffee shop was closed, the open sign dark, chairs still stacked on tables from the previous evening's cleaning. A handwritten note on the door read, "Closed temporarily for family emergency." Ellie pressed her face to the window, cupping her hands around her eyes to peer inside. Everything looked normal, supplies stocked, equipment clean and ready, but Marcus's car wasn't in its usual spot behind the building, and when she walked around back to check his apartment, the curtains were drawn tight. At the library, she threw herself into work with desperate focus, but her mind kept wandering to immigration websites and worst-case scenarios. During her lunch break, she walked back to the grind, still closed, still no sign of Marcus. Tuesday brought the same routine: work, worry, checking on the closed coffee shop. By Wednesday, other people were beginning to notice. Mrs. Patterson asked if she knew anything about Marcus's whereabouts when Ellie stopped by the bookstore. Tom Bradley mentioned that it was unusual for Marcus to close without giving customers more notice. "He's always been reliable," Tom said, scratching his head as they stood in front of the darkened shop. "Never missed a day in the 3 years he's been here. Hope everything's okay." But Mrs. Henderson, who had joined their impromptu gathering, wore a different expression entirely. "Well," she said with barely concealed satisfaction, "I suppose we all knew this day would come eventually." "What do you mean?" Ellie asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Henderson said with false sympathy, "surely you didn't think someone like that could just disappear into our community without consequences? There are proper ways to do things, proper procedures to follow." The implication hit Ellie like a cold wave. "You reported him." Mrs. Henderson's smile was sharp as winter frost. "I reported my concerns to the appropriate authorities, yes. It's our civic duty to ensure that everyone in our community is here legally and contributing appropriately." Tom Bradley looked horrified. "Edith, you can't be serious. Marcus is one of the best people in this town. He employs local kids, supports community events." "That may be," Mrs. Henderson interrupted, "but rules are rules, and I won't apologize for doing what's right." She walked away with the satisfied air of someone who had just revealed a particularly juicy piece of gossip, leaving Tom and Ellie staring after her in shock. "Jesus," Tom muttered. "What is wrong with people?" But Ellie was already walking away, her mind racing. If Mrs. Henderson had reported Marcus, and if his immigration status was genuinely under review, he could be in serious trouble. The kind of trouble that meant more than just closing the coffee shop temporarily. That evening, she called every hospital and police station within a 50-mile radius, claiming to be checking on a friend who hadn't been answering his phone. No one would give her information, but the process of elimination told her he wasn't in any local medical facility or county jail. Thursday morning, she drove to the immigration office in Burlington, a sterile federal building that felt deliberately Intimidating. The woman at the information desk was polite but firm. They couldn't provide information about specific cases to anyone not listed as family or legal representation. "I'm his friend," Ellie explained, hating how inadequate the word sounded. "I'm sorry," the clerk replied with practiced sympathy, "but without proper documentation of your relationship or legal standing, there's nothing I can tell you." Ellie spent Thursday evening researching immigration attorneys, making lists of people to call, trying to figure out how to help someone who had vanished without a trace. The irony wasn't lost on her. Marcus had talked about needing a place where people judged you by who you were today, rather than who you used to be, and now his past was apparently catching up with both of them. Friday brought no new information, just the growing certainty that Marcus was in serious trouble, and she was powerless to help. The coffee shop remained closed, his apartment dark, his phone going straight to voicemail. Saturday morning, desperate for any connection to him, Ellie returned to the hiking trail where they'd had their last conversation. She sat on the same fallen log where she'd found him, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The anonymous text, Mrs. Henderson's satisfied smile, Marcus's sudden disappearance. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle that would reveal something terrible. Once assembled, she was so lost in thought that she almost missed the sound of footsteps on the trail. When she looked up, expecting to see another hiker, she found herself face to face with a man in his 50s wearing a suit that looked expensive and out of place in the wilderness setting. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, consulting a small notebook. "I'm Agent Williams, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I wonder if I could ask you a few questions about Marcus Chen." Ellie's blood turned to ice. "I don't understand." "Mr. Chen listed you as a character reference on some recent documentation," Agent Williams said, settling onto a nearby rock, as if they were having a casual conversation. "We're trying to get a complete picture of his ties to the community." "Where is he?" Ellie demanded. "Mr. Chen is being held pending a review hearing," Agent Williams said matter-of-factly. "His case is complicated. There are questions about the validity of his original documentation, his employment status, his integration into the community." "He's been here for 3 years, Ellie protested. "He owns a business, employs people, contributes to the town, all of which will be taken into consideration," Agent Williams interrupted smoothly. "But there are also concerns about his recent behavior. Reports that he's been pursuing relationships that might indicate an attempt to circumvent proper immigration procedures." The accusation hung between them like a poisonous cloud. Ellie felt sick as she realized what Mrs. Henderson had probably told the authorities, that Marcus was using a relationship with a lonely divorced woman to try to secure his immigration status. "That's not true," she said firmly. "Whatever you think you know about our relationship, you're wrong." Agent Williams made a note in his book. "So, there is a relationship?" Ellie hesitated, suddenly aware that anything she said could be used against Marcus. "We're friends." "Friends," Agent Williams repeated, his tone suggesting he found the term inadequate. "Ms. Whitmore, I need to ask you directly. Has Mr. Chen ever discussed marriage with you? Has he ever suggested that a marriage might solve his immigration difficulties?" "No," Ellie said immediately, then felt a stab of pain at how true that was. Marcus had never mentioned marriage, had never even clearly stated his feelings for her until that moment on the trail when everything fell apart. "And you're certain that your relationship is purely platonic?" The question felt like a trap, no matter how she answered it. If she admitted to romantic feelings, it might support the theory that Marcus was using her. If she denied them, she'd be lying, and the lie might somehow be used against him later. "I care about Marcus," she said carefully, "but whatever relationship we have or might have had has nothing to do with his immigration status. I didn't even know there were any issues." With his documentation until this week, Agent Williams made more notes, his expression giving nothing away. Mr. Chen's hearing is scheduled for next Friday. If you have information relevant to his character or his integration into the community, you're welcome to submit a written statement. Can I see him? Only family members and legal representation are allowed visitation. Agent Williams stood, brushing leaves from his expensive suit. Ms. Whitmore, I want you to understand something. Immigration fraud is a serious federal crime. If we determine that Mr. Chen was attempting to use a relationship with you to circumvent immigration law, both of you could face significant legal consequences. The threat was delivered with the same casual tone he might use to comment on the weather, but it hit Ellie like a physical blow. After Agent Williams left, she sat on the trail for another hour, trying to process everything she'd learned. Marcus wasn't just missing, he was in federal custody, facing charges that could result in deportation or worse. And somehow, their relationship, tentative and new as it was, had become evidence against him. Mrs. Henderson's malicious gossip had been transformed into an official investigation that threatened to destroy the man Ellie was just beginning to love. That evening, she called every immigration attorney in Vermont, finally finding one willing to take a consultation call on Saturday night. David Chen, no relation to Marcus, despite the shared surname, was a second-generation immigrant himself who specialized in immigration law. The bad news, he told her after she'd explained the situation, is that immigration courts don't require the same burden of proof as criminal courts. Suspicion can be enough to deny status or order deportation. And the good news? Character witnesses can make a significant difference, especially if they can demonstrate genuine community ties and integration. But you need to be careful. If they think you're part of a fraudulent marriage scheme, you could be in legal jeopardy yourself. Ellie spent Sunday crafting a statement about Marcus's character and contributions to Millbrook, trying to strike a balance between honesty about their relationship and protection for both of them. She wrote about his kindness to elderly customers, his employment of local teenagers, his quiet generosity during community events. She wrote about his knowledge of local wildlife, his hiking trails, his careful attention to the needs of regular customers. What she didn't write about was the way her heart raced when he smiled, or how his kindness had begun to heal wounds she'd thought were permanent, or how much she'd come to love their morning conversations. Those truths felt too precious and too dangerous to commit to paper. Monday morning, she submitted her statement to the immigration court and began the terrible process of waiting. The coffee shop remained closed, its cheerful window display looking increasingly forlorn. Other businesses on Main Street began commenting on the absence. Marcus's shop had been an anchor for morning foot traffic, and his closure was affecting everyone. "It's not right," Mrs. Patterson said when Ellie stopped. "By the bookstore, Tuesday afternoon. Whatever's happening with Marcus, the way it's being handled is wrong. That man has done more for this community than half the people who were born here," but not everyone agreed. Ellie overheard conversations at the post office and grocery store that echoed Mrs. Henderson's satisfaction. Some people seemed genuinely pleased that their suspicions about the mysterious coffee shop owner had been validated. Others worried about what Marcus's situation might mean for other immigrants in the area. The town was dividing along lines that hadn't been visible before, and Ellie found herself at the center of a controversy she'd never wanted to join. People who had barely acknowledged her existence now watched her with open curiosity, and she heard whispers about the woman who got involved with that immigrant. By Thursday, the isolation was becoming unbearable. Ellie had moved to Millbrook to escape judgment and gossip, but now she found herself at the center of both. Worse, the man she was falling in love with was sitting in a detention facility somewhere, possibly believing that she'd abandoned him when things became complicated. Thursday evening, she made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would attend Marcus's hearing on Friday, regardless of whether she was allowed to speak. She would see him, let him know she hadn't given up, and face whatever consequences came from their association. But Friday morning brought a shock that changed everything. When she arrived at the grind for what had become a ritual of checking on the closed shop, she found the door propped open and Marcus inside, methodically cleaning equipment with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was avoiding thought. He looked up when the bell chimed, his expression cycling through surprise, relief, and something that might have been fear. "Ellie," he said, setting down the cloth he'd been using to polish the espresso machine. "You're here," she said stupidly, as if the evidence of her eyes needed confirmation. "I'm here," he agreed, but something in his tone suggested that might not be entirely good news. They stood facing each other across the small space that had been the site of so many morning conversations, but now felt charged with new tensions and unspoken truths. "The hearing," Ellie began. "Is over," Marcus interrupted. "My status has been resolved." The careful phrasing worried her. "Resolved how?" Marcus began arranging coffee cups with unnecessary precision. "I'm allowed to stay for now. Conditional permanent residency, pending final review in 2 years. That's good news, isn't it?" "It is," Marcus agreed, still not meeting her eyes. "But there are conditions, requirements I have to meet, people I need to avoid associating with. If I want the final approval to go through." The words hit her like ice water. "People like me." Marcus finally looked at her, and the pain in his expression confirmed her worst fears. "The investigator made it clear that my relationship with you was seen as problematic, a potential indicator of fraudulent intent." "So you're cutting me off to protect your immigration status," Ellie said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. Despite the way her heart was breaking, "I'm protecting both of us," Marcus said firmly. "If they decide I was using you for citizenship, you could face federal charges. I won't let that happen. Don't I get a say in what risks I'm willing to take?" Marcus slammed a coffee cup down harder than necessary, the sharp crack echoing through the empty shop. "You don't understand what you're saying. Federal charges, Ellie. Prison time. Your entire life destroyed because you were kind to someone. Who should have known better than to get you involved in this mess?" "This mess?" Ellie repeated, anger finally breaking through her shock. "Is that what our friendship was to you? A mess?" "Yes," Marcus said, but the word sounded like it was being torn from him. "Yes, it was a mess because I knew from the beginning that caring about you was selfish and stupid and dangerous for both of us, and I did it anyway." The admission hung between them, raw and honest and devastating. Ellie felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from frustration and loss and the cruel irony of finally hearing him acknowledge his feelings just as he was pushing her away. "So that's it?" she said. "You're just going to pretend nothing happened between us?" "Nothing did happen between us," Marcus said, turning back to his cleaning with renewed vigor. "We were customer and business owner. That's all we were. And that's all we can be. You're lying." "I'm surviving," Marcus snapped, whirling to face her. "I'm doing what I have to do to stay in this country, in this town, in the life I've spent 3 years building, and you should go back to your life too, before this gets any more complicated than it already is." Ellie stared at him, seeing the fear beneath his anger, the way his hands shook slightly as he gripped the counter. She understood suddenly that he wasn't just protecting his immigration status, he was protecting himself from the hope that had been growing between them. Hope that had already caused him so much trouble. "Fine," she said quietly. "I'll stay away from your shop. I'll find somewhere else to get my morning coffee. But Marcus..." He looked up, despite himself. "When you're ready to stop being afraid, I'll still be here. Because whatever else you want to call it, what happened between us wasn't nothing. And pretending it was won't make it disappear." She left without waiting for a response, walking quickly down Main Street with her head high, despite the tears threatening to spill over. Behind her, she heard the sound of something breaking. A cup, maybe, or something more fragile and irreplaceable. The next few weeks fell into a new, painful routine. Ellie made coffee at home and took a different route to work that avoided Main Street entirely. She threw herself into planning the library's holiday programs with fierce determination, staying late each evening to avoid the empty hours when she might be tempted to walk past the grind. The town, meanwhile, seemed to exhale with relief now that the drama of Marcus's immigration crisis had resolved itself. The coffee shop reopened with normal hours, and life in Millbrook resumed its comfortable patterns. Ellie heard through Mrs. Patterson that Marcus was back to his usual routine, polite, professional, serving coffee with efficient kindness, but none of the warmth that had made his shop feel like more than just another business. "He seems different," Mrs. Patterson confided when Ellie stopped by the bookstore 2 weeks before Christmas. "Sadder, somehow. And he asks about you." "He asks about me?" "Nothing direct," Mrs. Patterson clarified quickly. "Just mentions that he hasn't seen you around. Wonders if you're settling in well to small-town life. That sort of thing." Ellie felt a traitorous flutter of hope, quickly suppressed. Marcus had made his choice, and she had to respect it, even if she didn't agree with it. December brought Millbrook's annual holiday festival, a weekend-long celebration that transformed Main Street into something from a greeting card. White lights strung between lampposts, carolers in period costume, local businesses offering hot cider and seasonal treats. The library's booth featured a display of holiday books and a reading corner where Ellie told stories to bundled-up children. While their parents shopped, she'd been reading The Polar Express to a group of wide-eyed kindergartners when she became aware of someone watching from the edge of the crowd. When she looked up, she found Marcus standing near the back, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met for a moment across the heads of the children, and she felt that familiar flutter of connection before he turned away and disappeared into the crowd. After the story ended and the children scattered to find their parents, Ellie sat alone in the reading corner, trying to process the complex emotions that brief encounter had stirred up. She missed him, she realized. Not just their conversations or the way he made her coffee, but him, his quiet kindness, his thoughtful observations, the way he seemed to really see her when so many people looked right through her. "Miss Ellie," a small voice interrupted her. Brooding, she looked up to find Sophie Chen, a 7-year-old who had become one of her favorite library visitors. The girl was bundled in a bright red coat and matching mittens, her dark hair escaping from beneath a knitted hat. "Hi, Sophie," Ellie said, forcing a smile. "Did you enjoy the story?" "Yes, but I wanted to ask you something," Sophie said with the serious expression children wore when discussing important matters. "Why don't you come to Uncle Marcus's coffee shop anymore?" The question caught Ellie off guard. "Uncle Marcus?" "He's not really my uncle," Sophie explained with the matter-of-fact tone children used for complex family relationships. "But he's my dad's friend, and he always lets me have extra marshmallows in my hot chocolate. He seems sad lately, and Daddy said it might be because his friend stopped visiting." Ellie felt her heart clench. Marcus had never mentioned having close friends in town, but apparently he had connections she'd never known about. "Sometimes adults have complicated situations," she said carefully. "Are you mad at him?" Sophie asked with characteristic directness. "No, sweetie, I'm not mad at him." "Then you should visit him," Sophie said, with the kind of simple logic that made perfect sense until you were an adult dealing with immigration law and federal investigations and the weight of other people's judgments. Before Ellie could respond, a man approached, presumably Sophie's father. He was Asian American, probably in his late 30s, with kind eyes and an apologetic expression. "Sophie, don't bother Miss Whitmore," he said gently, then looked at Ellie. I'm David Chen, Sophie's dad, and as she mentioned, Marcus's friend. I hope she wasn't pestering you. Not at all, Ellie assured him, though her mind was racing. Another Chen. Was this the immigration attorney she'd consulted? Actually, are you by any chance the David Chen who practices immigration law? David's expression grew more serious. I am, and you're Eleanor Whitmore. I thought I recognized your voice from our phone consultation. You know each other. Sophie looked between them with interest. We talked on the phone once, David explained to his daughter, then looked back at Ellie. Would you mind if we spoke privately for a moment? They moved a few steps away from the reading corner while Sophie became absorbed in examining the holiday book display. David glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard before speaking. Marcus told me what happened, he said quietly. About the investigation, the conditions of his residency, all of it. Then you know why I can't... Actually, David interrupted. I know why Marcus thinks you can't be in contact, but I also know that his interpretation of the situation may be overly cautious. Ellie felt that dangerous flutter of hope again. What do you mean? The conditions placed on his residency are fairly standard, David explained. No criminal activity, maintaining steady employment, demonstrating community integration. There's nothing that specifically prohibits personal relationships with other legal residents. But the investigator said the investigator was trying to determine whether your relationship was fraudulent, David said. Since no marriage was involved and no immigration benefits were sought through that relationship, it's no longer legally relevant. Marcus is interpreting the situation through the lens of trauma and fear, not legal reality. Ellie stared at him, processing this information. You're saying there's no legal reason we can't be friends? I'm saying that Marcus is so afraid of losing his chance at permanent residency that he's cutting off all connections that feel risky, even when they're not actually prohibited. It's understandable, but it's also unnecessary. Have you told him this? David's expression grew rueful. I've tried, but Marcus is convinced that any relationship with you puts both of you in danger. He won't listen to legal advice when it contradicts his emotional need to protect you. Sophie had wandered back over during their conversation, and now she tugged on her father's coat. Daddy, can we get hot chocolate from Uncle Marcus? I'm cold. Of course, sweetheart, David said, then looked at Ellie meaningfully. You're welcome. So join us if you'd like. It might be an opportunity to have that conversation Marcus has been avoiding. Ellie hesitated, torn between hope and caution. Seeing Marcus again would be painful, especially if he maintained his determination to keep her at arm's length. But the possibility that their separation was based on unnecessary fear rather than legal reality changed everything. I don't know, she said. If he doesn't want to see me, he does want to see you, David said with quiet certainty. He just thinks he can't. Sometimes people need their friends to be braver than they can manage to be themselves. Sophie bounced, on her toes with excitement. Please come with us, Miss Ellie. Uncle Marcus makes the best hot chocolate, and he always looks happier when nice people visit his shop. The innocent invitation, combined with David's legal assessment, finally tipped the balance. Ellie nodded, her heart racing with nervous anticipation. The walk to the grind felt both endless and too short. Sophie chattered about her favorite holiday, books and her plans for Christmas morning, providing a cheerful counterpoint to Ellie's growing anxiety. David walked beside them, offering occasional reassurances that felt professional and personal in equal measure. Just remember, he said as they approached the coffee shop, Marcus's fear is real, even if it's not legally justified. Be patient. With him. The bell chimed as they entered, and Marcus looked up from behind the counter with a smile that froze when he saw Ellie. For a moment, The only sound was the gentle jazz music playing from speakers and the hiss of the espresso machine. "Sophie," Marcus said, recovering his composure and focusing on the little girl with obvious relief. "What brings you out on this cold afternoon?" "Hot chocolate with extra marshmallows," Sophie announced, climbing onto one of the tall stools at the counter. "And Daddy wanted to talk to you about boring grown-up stuff." Marcus's eyes flicked to David, then to Ellie, wariness replacing his initial pleasure at seeing his friends. "Marcus," David said gently, "we need to talk about your legal situation. Your actual legal situation, not the version you've created in your head." "Not here," Marcus said quickly, glancing around the shop even though they were the only customers. "Yes, here," David said firmly, "and now, before you do any more damage to yourself and people who care about you." Marcus began making Sophie's hot chocolate with unnecessary concentration, clearly trying to buy time to think. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "My situation is complicated. I can't afford to take risks." "What you can't afford," David replied, "is to isolate yourself based on misunderstandings about your legal requirements." Marcus set the hot chocolate in front of Sophie, complete with a small mountain of marshmallows that made the little girl beam with delight. Then he looked directly at Ellie for the first time since she'd entered the shop. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "According to your lawyer, there's no legal reason I can't be here," Ellie replied, surprised by her own steadiness. Marcus shot an angry look at David. "You don't understand the conditions." "I understand them perfectly," David interrupted. "I reviewed all the documentation. There is nothing that prohibits personal relationships with legal residents, nothing that requires you to isolate yourself from the community, nothing that makes friendship with Ellie a threat to your status." They said a lot of things designed to make you compliant and afraid," David cut him off. "That's what investigators do. But the actual legal requirements are much more straightforward than the fears they helped create." Marcus leaned against the counter, looking suddenly exhausted. "I can't take the risk." "The risk of what?" Ellie asked gently. "Having coffee with a friend, talking about books, being part of the community you've spent 3 years building." "The risk of caring about someone I might lose," Marcus said, the words coming out raw and unguarded. "The risk of dragging you into my problems again. The risk of hoping for something that immigration authorities might decide to take away." Sophie looked between the adults with the solemn expression children wore when they sensed important conversations happening above their heads. She took a careful sip of her hot chocolate, leaving a small mustache of foam on her upper lip. "Uncle Marcus," she said in the tone of someone delivering profound wisdom, "my teacher says that being scared of something bad that might happen is worse than just dealing with whatever actually happens." The adults turned to stare at her, and she shrugged with 7-year-old nonchalance. "Also," she added, "Miss Ellie looks sad when she talks about you, and you look sad when Daddy mentions her. So maybe you should just be friends and stop being sad." In the silence that followed, Ellie heard the jazz music playing softly, the distant sound of holiday festivities from the street, and her own heart beating with cautious hope. Marcus looked at Sophie, then at David, and finally at Ellie. Something in his expression was shifting, the careful walls he'd built around himself showing cracks. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. "I don't know how to care about someone without being afraid of losing them." "You do it one day at a time," Ellie said. "One conversation at a time, one cup of coffee at a time." "What if something happens? What if they change their minds about my status?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Ellie said simply. "That's what people do when they care about each other. They figure things out together." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if looking for something he'd lost and was afraid to hope he'd found again. "Medium coffee," he said finally. "Splash of cream, no sugar." It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise for the future, but it was an acknowledgement of connection, a willingness to return to the simple ritual that had brought them together in the first place. "That sounds perfect," Ellie said, settling onto the stool next to Sophie. As Marcus prepared her coffee, Ellie watched his hands, steady now, no longer shaking with fear or anger. When he set the cup in front of her, their fingers brushed in the familiar exchange, and this time, neither of them pulled away. "So," David said, settling onto a third stool and clearly trying not to look too pleased with himself, "now that we've resolved the legal questions, who wants to hear Sophie's theory about why Santa Claus is actually an expert in international shipping logistics?" Sophie launched into an elaborate explanation that involved reindeer-powered cargo planes and North Pole distribution centers. And for the first time in weeks, Ellie heard Marcus laugh, a real laugh, unguarded and warm. Outside, the holiday festival continued with its cheerful chaos of lights and music and celebration, but inside the grind, something quieter and more precious was being rebuilt: trust, hope, and the possibility that love could survive fear if people were brave enough to choose it. When Sophie finished her elaborate Santa theory, she looked at the adults expectantly. "That makes perfect sense," Marcus said seriously. "I never thought about the logistics involved. Most grown-ups don't think about the important stuff," Sophie replied, with the confidence of someone who had figured out how the world really worked. As the afternoon wore on, more customers drifted in from the festival, drawn by the warm light and the smell of coffee and hot chocolate. Marcus served them with his usual efficiency, but Ellie noticed something different in his demeanor. Less guarded, more present. When Mrs. Patterson stopped by for her usual afternoon tea, she beamed at seeing Ellie there and made a point of commenting on how nice it was to see friends catching up. Even Mrs. Henderson's appearance didn't shatter the peaceful atmosphere. She ordered her coffee with pointed politeness, her sharp eyes taking in the scene of Ellie, David, and Sophie clustered around the counter like evidence of some crime she couldn't quite identify. But when Sophie cheerfully wished her a happy holiday, the older woman's expression softened slightly, and she left without making any cutting remarks. "I should probably head home," Ellie said as the winter light began to fade. "Early day tomorrow." "Same time tomorrow morning?" Marcus asked, and there was uncertainty in his voice, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. 15, Ellie confirmed, feeling something settle into place in her chest. "Medium coffee, splash of cream, no sugar." "I'll be here," Marcus said, and this time it sounded like a promise. Walking home through the festival-decorated streets with David and Sophie chattering beside her about hot chocolate recipes and holiday plans, Ellie felt lighter than she had in weeks. The situation was still complicated. Marcus's immigration status, the town's opinions, their own careful hearts. But complications weren't the same as impossibilities. That night she pulled out the note Marcus had given her during that first rainy morning, the one she'd kept pressed between the pages of her book. "Some conversations are worth the wait, M." The words felt like prophecy now, a promise that patience and persistence could sometimes overcome fear. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow covering Millbrook like a blessing. Ellie woke early and made herself coffee at home, but it tasted thin and unsatisfying compared to Marcus's careful brewing. She found herself counting the hours until the grind would reopen after the holiday, until she could return to the ritual that had anchored her days and connected her to something larger than her own carefully contained life. When she finally pushed through the familiar door at 7:15 the next morning, Marcus looked up with a smile that reached his eyes for the first time since his return. "Merry Christmas," he said, already reaching for her cup. "Merry Christmas," she replied, and settled into the chair by the window that felt like it had been waiting for her. Outside, Millbrook was waking up to the aftermath of holiday celebrations, decorations looking slightly worse for wear, shop, windows displaying post-Christmas sale signs, the gentle melancholy that followed all anticipated events. But inside the grind, with morning light streaming through frost-etched windows and the familiar rhythm of coffee preparation providing soundtrack, Ellie felt the quiet satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged. "So," Marcus said, setting her coffee on the small table and settling into the chair across from her, "tell me about your Christmas." It was such a simple question, the kind friends asked each other, but it felt revolutionary after weeks of careful distance and calculated politeness. Ellie found herself talking about her quiet morning, the book she'd been reading, her plans to organize the library's New Year display. Marcus told her about closing early on Christmas Eve to help David's family prepare dinner, about Sophie's elaborate theories regarding Santa's technological capabilities, about the peaceful satisfaction of having nowhere urgent to be. They talked until other customers began arriving, requiring Marcus's attention behind the counter. But even as he served coffee and pastries to the morning rush, Ellie felt included in the rhythm of his work, part of the community that gathered each day in this warm space. "Same time tomorrow?" Marcus asked as she prepared to leave. "Every morning," Ellie said, and meant it as both promise and hope. Walking to work through streets, slowly returning to post-holiday normal, Ellie reflected on how much had changed since that first rainy October morning when she'd stumbled into the grind, looking for nothing more than caffeine and routine. She'd found friendship, connection, the beginning of love, and the kind of community acceptance that couldn't be demanded, but had to be earned through patience and authentic presence. At the library, she threw herself into post-holiday tasks with renewed energy, but her mind kept drifting to the morning's conversation and the promise of tomorrow's continuation. Mrs. Carruthers stopped by to discuss upcoming programming, and for the first time, since the immigration crisis, she didn't make any pointed comments about certain people or complications. Perhaps the resolution of Marcus's legal situation had satisfied the community's need for drama, or perhaps people had simply grown tired of manufacturing controversy where none truly existed. That afternoon, as Ellie arranged returned holiday books and planned displays for the new year, she realized that she was no longer the same woman who had fled to Millbrook seeking nothing more than anonymity and peace. She'd found those things, but she'd also found the courage to want more: connection, love, the messy complications of caring about another person's happiness as much as her own. The next morning, Marcus was waiting with her coffee and a small wrapped package beside her. "Cup. A belated Christmas gift," he explained, suddenly shy. "I wasn't sure, but I wanted you to have it." Inside was the book on Vermont wildlife that had sat on his counter during those early weeks of their friendship, the one with post-it notes, marking favorite passages and margin notes in his careful handwriting. "You said the library copy was always checked out," he said, "and I thought you might like to see the places I wrote about when the weather gets warmer, if you're interested." It was an invitation to share his hiking trails, his quiet refugees, his deeper knowledge of the place they both called home. It was also, Ellie realized, an invitation to imagine a future together, one that extended beyond morning coffee conversations into shared experiences and mutual exploration of the world around them. "I'd love that," she said, meaning more than just the hiking. Spring, when it finally arrived in Vermont, brought the kind of transformation that made winter's hardships feel worthwhile. Millbrook shed its coating of snow and ice to reveal tender green shoots and the promise of warmth returning to the world. Ellie and Marcus began taking weekend walks on the trails he'd described, sharing the quiet satisfaction of watching the forest wake up from its long sleep. Their relationship deepened gradually, built on a foundation of daily conversations and shared observations about books, nature, and the small dramas of small-town life. They were careful with each other, respectful of the fears that had nearly separated them, but they were also honest about their growing feelings and their hopes for the future. Mrs. Henderson still watched them with occasional disapproval, but her objections carried less weight now that Marcus's legal situation was resolved and the community had grown accustomed to seeing them together. Other townspeople began including them as a unit in social invitations and casual conversations, accepting their relationship as another piece of Millbrook's evolving identity. On a warm morning in late May, almost 8 months after that first rainy encounter, Ellie arrived at the grind to find Marcus waiting with her usual coffee and an expression of nervous excitement. "I have something to tell you," he said, and for a moment her heart clenched with old fears. Good news or bad news? Good news. Great news, actually. Marcus's smile broke through his nervous energy. "My permanent residency was approved. No more conditions, no more reviews. I'm here to stay, officially and permanently." Ellie set down her coffee and threw her arms around him without thinking, feeling his laughter rumble through his chest as he held her close. It was their first real embrace, spontaneous and joyful, and witnessed by the early morning customers who broke into scattered applause. "I'm so happy for you," Ellie murmured against his shoulder. "I'm happy for us," Marcus replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. When they finally separated, Ellie noticed Mrs. Henderson standing in the doorway, having witnessed the entire exchange. For a moment, the two women looked at each other across the small space filled with coffee-scented air and morning light. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Henderson nodded, not approval exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition that some battles weren't worth fighting, and some kinds of happiness were too genuine to dispute. "Well," she said briskly, approaching the counter, "I suppose congratulations are in order. And I'll have my usual, Marcus, when you're ready." As Marcus prepared Mrs. Henderson's coffee with his characteristic attention to detail, Ellie settled into her chair by the window and looked out at Main Street, waking up to another day. The view was the same as it had been during those first uncertain weeks. The same shops, the same morning commuters, the same rhythm of small-town life continuing its ancient patterns. But everything had changed too. She was no longer the divorced woman hiding from her past, and Marcus was no longer the man afraid to hope for a future. They were simply themselves, connected by daily ritual and growing love, part of a community that had learned to make room for their story. Outside the window, spring sunshine illuminated the street with golden light, promising warmth and growth, and all the possibilities that came with seasons of change. And inside the grind, as Marcus handed Mrs. Henderson her coffee with a smile that had lost all traces of fear, Ellie understood that some stories didn't end with dramatic declarations or life-changing moments. Sometimes they ended with the quiet satisfaction of being exactly where you belonged, with someone who knew how you took your coffee and was willing to make it for you every morning for as long as mornings lasted. "Same time tomorrow?" Marcus asked, though by now it was more tradition than question. "Every morning," Ellie replied, as she had every day for months, and outside Millbrook continued its gentle pace. One more love story woven into the fabric of a community that had learned slowly and sometimes reluctantly that the best kinds of change were the ones that brought people together rather than driving them apart. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel, subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments so you don't miss the next episodes. See you in the next story.